Do you want to add or move some electrical sockets in your home? Well, today on Fix It with Fowler, I'm going to show you how to add and move some sockets, including some basic electrical principles to keep you safe. On a previous video, I showed you how to chop out these back boxes into the wall and create these chases. So now you've done that, let's get on with the wiring. So before you start wiring these sockets, there's a few things you need to understand. Now, socket circuits can be wired in two ways. Firstly, they can be wired as a ring main. That means they start at the consumer unit with a 2.5 twin and earth cable. It leaves the consumer unit and goes all the way around the different socket outlets. It then returns back to the consumer unit and creates a ring main. And that is normally controlled by a 32 amp breaker. Now that has an advantage because you can plug more things in and the circuit can be bigger. However, on newer properties and a new way of wiring these sockets is to do something called a radial circuit. Now that starts at the consumer unit and goes to each individual socket and then stops at the last one. It does not go back to the consumer unit. Normally they are wired in 2.5 twin and earth cable protected by a 16 amp breaker, and that limits the length of the circuit due to something called volt drop. Now, in this particular case, this is wired in 4mm twin and earth controlled by a 20 amp breaker, and that means the circuit can be a bit longer and we can pick up more sockets. This radial circuit comes from the consumer unit, goes through the office next door, and then originally came to a socket down here. Now what I've done is I've took the cable out, threaded it under the floor and put a temporary socket here, so we've still got power in this room. So what we're going to do now is take a cable from under the floor ready to be connected later on. We're going to take that up to this socket here, back down, and then it's going to come back under the floor to this socket over here. So I'm going to come out of that socket along to this central floorboard. Now these have all been taken up, so we're going to then run the cable down through this floorboard along here and then over to that socket. We'll go up and down to pick that socket up, come back under the floor, and then finally over to this socket. We're going to go up into the socket and then we're going to go back down into the floor. We're going to leave the cable coiled up, ready to make the final connections through to the next bedroom. Once you've planned the route of your cables, the next stage will be to lift the floorboards. Now I've got a whole dedicated video on that, and that'll help you avoid any of the common pitfalls. The other thing you need is to get yourself one of these thin crowbars, and it's invaluable. You can get that down the side of the floorboard and it'll help you lift them out really easily. Now the next thing is drilling joists. Now when you come to drill the joists, my recommendation would be find the center of the joist and drill through there. Don't drill anywhere near any of the holes because you're going to end up weakening the joist. As far as size goes, I would go a bit bigger than the cable that you're going to be putting in, and I'd also allow for an extra cable just for the future. So to start the wiring, I've got my 4mm twin and earth. Now when you come to run this in, don't pull it off the drum like that because it will all kink and it will make it a lot harder to make it neat. So what I recommend is spinning the drum round like that, and then that way when the cable comes off it will stay nice and flat. Now getting to these sockets can be difficult. I've got certain floorboards up so access is limited. Now you can either run it under the floor and then try and feed it up, or you can push it down into the floor space and then feed it where you need to go. So we're going to start by getting a cable from this socket to under the floor ready to be joined. So I'm going to feed that just straight down to a hole I've already made, which will take us through into the floor space. To install the link between the first socket and the second socket, I use these cable access rods. Now I've used these loads of times and they're great for getting under floorboards without lifting too many. They just screw together, you can slide them under the floor and then simply tape the cable on and pull it through to where you need it. On long runs of cable, I like to start in the middle, especially if I'm using existing holes because they can get quite tight. In this instance, I've run the cable along this central run. I'll then pull it through the floor using the rods to the second socket. I can then measure off the remaining run of cable while it's still on the drum, cut it to length and then thread it into position to this third socket. Using the cable access rods, I now install the link between the third socket and the fourth socket. I now install the final link from the last socket to under the floor. That's the sockets all wired, and this cable here will go under the floor ready to be connected once everything is filled. The next stage is to get some cable clips and put clips in anywhere you can to support the cable. Although this isn't a requirement, I like to install this metal capping over the cables. That way it will hold them into position when you come to patch it or plaster, and also it will prevent any movement of the cables, which again will crack the plaster when you come to terminate the cables. Have you subscribed to my channel? Well, if not, why not? It does not cost a thing. You're missing out on loads of great content. If I'm not making things like this, I'm fixing shed roofs, I'm mending doors, windows, doing plumbing or electrics. You name it, I've got it on my channel. So head over, hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to leave this video a comment and a thumbs up, and that will help it reach loads of other people. So that is the sockets all filled and sanded, ready for the second fixing of putting the fronts on. Now I have already isolated this circuit, so that means we can work on not only these sockets, but the joint under the floor. If you want to know how I filled and sanded these sockets and got such a good result, then head over, there's a link in the corner and that will show you a detailed video of how I achieved this. So back to the sockets then. The first thing we're going to do is second fix all of the socket fronts. To strip the cable, I use some side cutters. I cut down the side of the earth and then pull this earth to cut all the way down the outer sheath. I then trim the outer sheath using the side cutters, cut the wires to length and then sheathe the earth with some earth sleeving. I then put one of the earths into the back box and then put a link from this earth terminal to the earth terminal on the socket itself. You can now terminate these wires into the socket front. A top tip, once you've actually connected the socket, give each wire a little pull to make sure it's tight into the terminals and won't pull out when you screw the socket front back to the wall. You can now screw the socket front back to the wall, ensuring it is nice and level. And now repeat that for the remaining sockets. So this is the supply from the bedroom next door, and then that is going to be joined to this, which is the cable that supplies the new sockets. And it really is straightforward. You just strip the cable like we did before in the back of the sockets, and then using something like these push fit connectors, you can then put them in, snap them shut, and that is the connections finished. You can then encase it in something like a shock box or some sort of junction box, screw that to the joist, and then you can put the floor back. So that is all the electrical connections complete, and we can now look at energizing the circuit. However, before you actually turn it on, there is a few tests that you should carry out to ensure that all the connections are right and there's no damage to any cables. However, I'm going to cover all that in a future video dedicated to electrical testing. So let's consider that we've done those tests and everything is good. We can now energize the circuit. So the final thing I like to do is function test the sockets, and using one of these socket testers, you can just plug that in and test each socket Make sure that you put it in both sides of the socket to ensure that they're both correct. Sometimes you can get a manufacturer's fault, very rare, but it's worth double checking. So if you like that video and found it helpful, please give the video a thumbs up and don't forget, leave me a comment, and that will help this video reach loads of other people. And as a final thing, if you could hit that subscribe button, you won't miss out on any of my future DIY videos.